But maybe I'll start with a bit of kind of background and biographical information. My background, as Lukas said, is in architecture design and history and theory of architecture. And I first moved to Berlin in end of 2004, or rather four, to work at an architecture firm. And just before that, I was studying, I was doing a history and theory class and master's. And in that, I kind of started to understand architecture beyond building design and beyond just kind of what buildings look like and how to design them, but as a larger social system. And it wasn't very formulated exactly what I was thinking about, what I wanted to reach, but in any case, I went to Berlin and started working in an architecture firm. And almost immediately felt somehow dissatisfied with the work after a very theoretical 2 years. And at about that time, in early 2005, I started working at the Neue Nationalgalerie. There was a job there for the assistant to the architecture curator, at the time Andres Lepik. And I was interested, and then immediately got the job. Apparently no one else was interested in such a thing. We literally met at a cafe, and then he said, start in an hour if you like, so that's how that began. But the question of architecture exhibition making started then, and we would do research, we would find information about exhibitions that we wanted to do and do funding, and then they would be presented. And this is an exhibition called Berlin-Tokyo that presented artists from both Berlin and Tokyo and historically the relationship between the two cities. And this landscape is made by Toyo Ito. And so at this point, for me, exhibition making was very much about a scenographic kind of architecture anyways, about a scenographic display and then putting stuff on it. So what goes on this surface is kind of text and information and artworks. But what was so amazing for me and about this image is the way that the kind of exhibition design itself is an exhibition. You can be on it, you can walk on it, you can probably skate off of it. And the way that it responds to the mise space, the way that it responds to the grid, the way that it starts to play with it and activate it and make you aware of it was in the end much more powerful for me. And also around this time, I was asked to do a small architecture exhibition about the size of this space over here, and it was to work with a Norwegian artist and a group of Norwegian architects. And the process of talking through ideas, talking through how to present them, how to communicate very abstract processes to a general audience was something that became very interesting to me. And then the more I started looking at architecture exhibitions, I just Googled this last night, but it's from the Shusev State Museum in Russia. And it's an exhibition of new Finnish buildings. And the question of what is an architecture exhibition became, really a question when I had to do my own shows. So I was thinking too that, definitely the history of exhibition making in general, if you think of it as something that started with salons, isn't more than 200 some odd years for art, and it's not longer than that for architecture. So it's definitely a new field of activity. And definitely ripe for re-questioning and rethinking, and there was really no point in trying to find what was done before and then doing the same thing. And the majority of architecture exhibitions that I was exposed to were shows that had pictures of buildings, so photographs, or videos of buildings, and mostly plan section elevations, drawings of buildings, and this struck me as kind of particularly problematic, specifically when you have a general audience, a non-architecture audience coming through. They oftentimes don't know how to read plans. and the pictures of the buildings don't show them anything of the quality of architecture other than what the building looks like. So the way that we experience this room, me standing here with this light, you guys being in here before, we all experience it very differently. And these qualities of space, of architecture, are never attempted to be reconstructed or displayed or exhibited in architecture exhibitions. So this is just another one I found. It's the Venice Biennial, the Australian pavilion that was organized by RMIT. And again, we see the plans and the drawings are on these tables, and then we have photographs on the wall. And what struck me, so in 2005, I mean, the internet was already, something that we use every day, all the time, constantly. And it struck me that to ask someone to take the bus or a subway for half an hour and then come to a room to see something that they could easily see in a published form, where they can take their time to peruse it as they wish, or online, seems to be doubly as kind of problematic or slightly pointless. And so the question of what is an architecture exhibition, how do you exhibit architecture, became more urgent. And during this time when I was doing this little exhibition, a friend from grad school came to visit, and she thought, wait, we can do this ourselves. Why don't we really test this idea of architecture exhibition making? We started looking at different models of architecture exhibitions. This is the Hansaviertel in Berlin, which I'm sure you all know about. But what's interesting about it, it was part of the IBA projects that was spoken about earlier. And from 1957 to 1961, and it was conceived as an architecture exhibition. It was housing, and people actually lived there, but it was conceived as an exhibition, and you can see the cable cars that used to run over it, and there would be guides that would tell you who did what, people from Egon Eiermann to Alvar Aalto, Arne Jacobsen. So the kind of really important architects of the time were showing off their ideas in this neighborhood. So this is one way to do an architecture exhibition where you don't have to think about how do we put things inside a room, how do we show architecture without representing it. Again, another kind of paradox where problem I saw was when you go to an art exhibition, you see the actual art. When you go to an architecture exhibition, you see representations of buildings mostly. So this was, made it very uninteresting to the public. And I think we were, with Martha, we were talking about architecture exhibitions, and she said, well, the problem is they're just boring, So with Fotini, my partner for this new project, we decided, okay, let's really test it out. One of the first examples that we looked at was a work of Carson Feireiss, who, beyond being a critic and a curator and commissioner for the German Pavilion 1996 and year 2000, and also the former director of the Netherlands Architecture Institute, is also Lucas's mom, and also started IDIS Gallery, which is a prominent architecture gallery 25 odd years ago, right? 35 years, right? And this exhibition particularly was interesting in terms of sort of a shift in thinking of architecture exhibition making, and it's from 97. It was in the Netherlands Architecture Institute, and it's a solo exhibition of Daniel Libeskind. And what I thought was so great was that the space of the exhibition itself was used to express the architect's ideas. So you have, so instead of just putting drawings on walls, you now have the space completely redone with Daniel Libeskind's spatial language, with the surfacing. And so this we thought was pretty amazing. But then in the end, though, it seemed almost that architects or the people that go to architecture exhibitions still demand drawings and demand some kind of information other than just space. than what could be presented in a gallery through spatial manipulation. And so here the drawings and models are put on the surface. And I think what we saw was problematic with this example is that where the object of exhibition, the space of the exhibition, could have been highlighted by the transformation, what looks to be an extremely expensive transformation at that, was kind of sort of the power of that message was taken away by putting the drawings on the walls and sort of using the whole thing more scenographically, sort of like the Neue National Gallery example that I showed earlier. So you can see here that it became, we almost saw, the show could have been without everything and just, that space itself. So when we started our space, this is one of our first shows, and we had to ask ourselves, okay, so what is architecture then? If we can't be always building Hansaviertel and we can't always be, changing a space completely because of budget reasons, then why don't we try to redefine these two things? And so architecture for us, and what it was most meaningful for us, was that it was definitely a spatial thing, and what we want to exhibit definitely has to be spatial. But it was so many other layers as well. So we use this definition, which is basically it's a spatial practice of a body of knowledge that comes from history, politics, context, economics. So all the different kind of social factors, but kind of enacted spatially, can provide moments of architecture. And this we saw as a particularly useful definition too, because so much around us, so many buildings that are around us would hardly be considered architecture. In the States, I think 10% of all buildings are built by architects and the rest by developers and engineers. And so would it make sense to start looking at everything as architecture or just what is kind of specifically understood as the spatial practice? Just like how if I were to make a painting right now, we might not call it art, we would call it painting, and not all buildings are architecture. So this was, so when we first started the space, we found a space that was 400 square meters in the center of town, so about 4,000 square feet. And at that time, it was about €2 a square meter. So we paid about 800 euros for this huge space. And so we had to develop different ideas for it. We didn't have a budget, but we started a residency program, a reading group, so on and so forth. And one of our first exhibitions, we didn't have much of a budget, but we had met a lot of painters who were living in Berlin. And painting, kind of by definition, is an art form that doesn't really deal with a lot of architectural ideas, insofar as a painter doesn't work often with a specific context. They work in their studios and then they ship the canvas somewhere. They don't often think about adjacencies and how things are experienced. So we thought, how about if we challenge painters, the people that we first met in Berlin, and ask them to do a group painting show, but they had to paint on the walls. And we drew a datum line, a horizon line around the whole room, and asked them to make landscape paintings. And so we did that. And so we had them all meet together, and then we said, you have to find a location, you have to understand the space. So there's columns, there's different corners, and they had to negotiate with people around them, next to them, how they would interact with the space. And so in doing so, they had to, in a way, start to work like architects and think through architectural questions to arrive at this exhibition. And so this is sort of the beginning of how we started to call these exhibitions architecture exhibitions. I think I will just skip through many of the examples until I find one that, this is a laser exhibition for architects from UN studios, and they wanted to test out different configurations of laser and how that would create space. And so you'll see, this was more of an experiment. In a lot of these, in all the exhibitions, we try not to have any text on the walls, and that it's about experiencing the different things that are in the room. There is a text available, obviously, and then which has biographical information and background information. This is an exhibition by Edith de Kind, and it's an exhibition that she kind of questions basic fundamental things that one assumes in architecture, like gravity, for example. This is a balloon that hovers in the space. And then there are other kind of parts of the exhibition that continue to question different physical laws. I guess I'll talk about the different projects and why we thought they were interesting to do. This is Matthias Ballestrom and Anton Burdakov. Matthias is an architect and Anton's an artist. And in the first discussions we had, we were really kind of interested in the idea that, or questioning architecture and its representation, and how oftentimes when we see things, when we experience things or talk about exhibitions, we see them through representation, so online. And this is, very much the same with art as well. Everyone says they've seen something or seen the show, but in fact they've seen the documentation of it. So this exhibition, they made an installation in the space. So you can see on this large piece of paper, an installation in the same space that had different cutouts on the wood surfaces. And when photographed, it creates an image. And the exhibition was the documentation of the structure that's no longer there. See that. This I will skip. There's an exhibition by Rodney Latourelle. So here's the front of the space. To continue with the question of curating, I guess, and what is curating, I think through architecture, I've kind of, for me, distilled the different roles of exhibition making. And curating being one that I would more closely ally with architecture. There's selecting artists and selecting people for an exhibition. There's administrating of exhibitions. There's organizing them. And curating, I would say, is one where the space of the exhibition, the context of the exhibition, including social, economic, all those contexts are folded into the experience of the exhibition and considered as part of the experience. I think one reason why exhibition making could be interesting for architects is that it provides a really cheap and quick way to test ideas. Buildings, take a long time; they're expensive, but exhibitions don't. And they also allow for a certain amount of failure to happen. And where with buildings, it's a process that just generally can't happen. This is a video exhibition we did, where the videos were somehow spatialized by an architect. I'll just skip through these. This is an example. It's called The Traffic of Clouds. And it was a collaboration that we organized between a group of architects, Hackenbroich and Jan Christensen, an artist from Norway. And we wanted to further this kind of intersection of the creative process between the two fields. One reason that we started program, one of the mandates we had was to try to define architecture as how we said with this definition, but through finding its disciplinary boundaries by having it collaborate with other disciplines. So art, we've worked with musicians, dancers. So with this one, the architects from the very beginning worked with an artist to develop, and in the very beginning it was just conversations. Jan's background is a street artist, and so the outdoors, graffiti, all that was really interesting to him, important for him. And Hackenbroich was really interested in structures and how structures can create spatial effects. And so through about 9 months of kind of talking, and working through different ideas, the architects created a structure based on some of Jan's images and designs. And Jan wanted to bring the idea of outdoors with his street art background indoors. And so we made the whole exhibition into a park with Wi-Fi, and people were allowed to come in and sit down, and there were performances. This is one of our last exhibitions. I won't talk about it. This was an interesting exhibition for us. We oftentimes bring groups of artists or architects into the space and say, you have 2 weeks, do whatever you like. But then throughout the whole process, as curators, we would constantly be in discussion with them, and through that shape kind of the outcome. And this one called 32 Fingers, the artists collectively actually have 32 fingers, which is kind of impressive for us. And they wanted to build a smaller version of the gallery space. So what you see here is actually a half-scale model of the gallery. So it's like this, but you can see the guy in there. And they built this in about 3 days. And what was interesting was that they created an exhibition in which the object was also the container. But the container was an institution that came with a set of rules as well. And our mandate was to make architecture exhibitions. So by fulfilling that, what they wanted to do was then make other exhibitions inside the smaller space of their own desire. So there was an idea to do a ceramic show or watercolors. In the end, what was more interesting was the space between the big gallery and the small gallery, and that became almost like an extra institutional space. And there they invited 10 other artists and did all sorts of other things. I think what's been interesting for this whole process is to see how the exhibition itself is the object of discourse. Rather than what we put in it, we can use exhibition to create ideas. And I won't be able to talk about all the examples that we've tried to test this idea, but this is the kind of in between, the interstitial space between the small gallery and the other one. And they built this wooden construction that has a river of blood, of fake blood. And then some other artists put this kind of turning device that they kind of taped some musicians onto it. And then they would play music, and then they were roasting pigs. So basically, a lot of different activities that we would never think to allow, that they've allowed themselves by kind of reconstructing the gallery. Here's a small gallery with the river of blood flowing inside. I thought to include this one because there's, just throughout the last 2 days, we've been discussing the Berlin Biennial a little bit, the idea of politics, how do kind of so-called real-world kind of things enter in the exhibition space, and how does one deal with it? And I think this was a particularly, for us, problematic but generative project. And it's with artist Ariel Reichmann. He's an Israeli artist. Grew up on a settlement, and he was in the army, like all Israeli people, and he was also involved in the Battle of Jenin, year 2002, and which was extremely violent, and it was only after his time with the military, the army, that he went to art school and saw things completely differently, and it was this kind of long process of rethinking and processing for him. And so we had, we started talking, and he said, could I do something there, and as a form of reflection? And we said, sure. And the first idea was he wanted to recreate a house, to make a house, the house that he was living in in the settlement. But just prior to that, we had made this exhibition with American artist Ethan Hayes Shute, in which he was kind of exploring the ideas of coziness, the primitive hut, and the kind of, not telepresence, but the transporting of of ideology and space through kind of space making. And so we thought, and this was meant to be, cute very much. And so we didn't want to compare this with the settlement project. So we said, why don't you simply live in the space? And then we see, by giving you the keys, by giving you access to the space, we can sort of, and through discussion and recording these discussions, see at what point does the simple act of living become something else. So he brought materials, he put a bed there. You can see he's constructing it with a friend. There it is at night. When people came to visit the exhibition, we would often have school groups. They'd take group photos. He'd lock the door and he would control when we would enter and not enter it. He played music whenever he wanted. And so it was really interesting for us, this kind of question of control, and at what point the simple act of living become territorial. And so this was a way, I think, for us to continue discussing or bring political questions within a gallery space. It was also a reaction to an exhibition about settlements at the KW in Berlin by Anselm Franke, in which it was, and A.L. Weitzman, in which it was extremely well kind of archival and documentation. But we felt that it merely showed or explained a thesis. And this one, when people came, it kind of enacted and performed those ideas. Here's the kitchen area. Ariel took many of these photos, so having friends over. Putting up a flag was important. And then to close off, I'll just talk about the latest project, which is the Marrakesh Biennale. Which, for me, threw a lot of things up in the air again. I'd never been to Africa, let alone Morocco or Marrakesh, before starting this project. And I think for the initiators, it was interesting that I was working with space and architecture, and it wasn't, for some reason, important for them that I had a deep knowledge in that region, which in the end I wish I had more of. But the first thing that I wanted to know was who was the audience, who was my audience, who's going to come look at these, the exhibition, and what were the problems I'm going to encounter. And so the history of exhibition making, one can say, art exhibition making in Morocco started, I guess, with the French protectorate in 1912. And at that time, culture and exhibition was meant very much as part of commerce. So carpets were displayed, kind of pottery, and these were very much kind of legislated as to what kind of things can be displayed. And up until, the legislation of art and exhibition went up until 1956 when the country became independent. But at that point, it became important for Moroccan artists, no longer having to follow kind of cultural laws as to what they can produce. They wanted to become international. So at that time, the most international form was abstract expressionism, Paris, New York, and so painting became a very symbolic trope for Moroccan artists at the time, and it still is. Most in all the art schools, I would say, teach painting and abstract painting at that still. And so what this kind of produces is a situation in which during the protectorate, art was for, museums were for the elite, all the signs were in French. And after independence, art continued to be for the elite. Unless you were versed in the language of abstract expressionism, you had no access to it. And so there was, just very quickly, at the Jamal Fana Square, which is the main square in Marrakesh, a group of students from the Casablanca Art School made an exhibition of their paintings in 1967. And the reaction was, and also in a high school, and they asked for the public reaction to these things, and the students were, many of them, in fact, quite angry. They said that you're showing us that we're uneducated and that we don't know how to look at these things. So this is how I came into the project, knowing that art has been something for the elite, and it has been met with criticism when people see something and don't understand it. And so I had to kind of find completely new, not completely new tools, but try to rethink the role of the curator in a place like Marrakesh, where contemporary art isn't shown so often. One of our sites, just very quickly, is the Théâtre Royal, which is above. It's an unfinished opera house that Hassan II in the late 60s commissioned, 68 rather, right after a trip to Paris, and it's supposed to be modeled after the Opera Garnier, which is really bizarre because after being freed from French colonization, he went back to France to then re-import French culture to Morocco. It's unfinished because they realized there's no audience for French opera. And the bottom is an installation by Barco Leibinger Architects, and it's right next to the main mosque. And so just quickly about the method was that we wanted to create things that were physically experienceable, and so you don't have to read a text. In fact, we didn't put the names of the artists next to any of the work. You had to. It was available. There were sheets of paper that made it available. But we wanted people to physically experience it and to confront it through experience. And so it was pretty amazing to see as this loom next to the mosque was being put up. The first reaction was curiosity or amusement, and then when people stayed longer and looked longer, they started to ask questions and ask for the leaflets. So this is the last project I'll talk about, and it's called Mud Brick Spiral by Ellen Hansdottir. It's part of the Marrakesh Biennale, and I think it's interesting because for Ellen, the point of the work, and we had probably a year of discussion on this work. The point of the work was very much form making and how one can create a form and create an experience, and that itself exists already as a political gesture, but it went so much further than that, and I'll tell you why. So here are some drawings of just the development of different forms. She's an Icelandic artist, but is based in Berlin. And here's a Lego model of it. And she also won a residency in Marrakesh. And it's a very interesting residency. It's based in a luxury resort, which is about 15 minutes outside of Marrakesh. And it's in Hotel Fella, but the residency is called Dar Mamoun. And so right next to this 5-star resort, she had her own villa there. It was extremely luxurious, but problematic because Morocco is developing. And so to bring artists within this kind of walled community was just a very bizarre situation. Here's the wall. And so this hotel is right next to a village called Tassultante, about 1,000 people, semi-rural village. They were happy. They weren't wealthy people, but people had jobs, and it was fine. And so Ellen was visiting this village quite a lot, and she was really interested in the mud brick architecture that was happening there. And so she wanted to build her piece next in the village on this field with the mud brick and with the local intelligence. So these were her workers, the children that would come every day. And so this is the beginning. I'll just quickly go through these. The kids were there every day, all the time. And so as she was doing this project, she realized that it became a big part of the community. They were very happy that it was for her. It wasn't a humanitarian project. She wasn't digging people wells. She wasn't building a school. But that culture was being invested into a space, and people were really interested in that. Here are the kids, and here's the beginning of the wall. They're making lunch. They killed a rabbit for her one day. There's her on the left. And here, and after a while, for her ease of movement, the luxury hotel started to make a hole in the wall that divided the 5-star resortness of it, and then the field. And then this is the final project. And what was so amazing is that now the people in the village meet there, and they have local discussions about local politics. And the kind of idea that form making, the art and the structure being an uncommon form of communication gave people the license to also engage in other uncommon forms of communication. I guess I'll skip this one, but this, and then I'll just end with this image, which is a piece by Karthik Pandyan. He was interested in how Marrakesh and Morocco was used as a stand-in for so many other places, alien places. Ridley Scott's Prince of Persia was filmed there. And so he got this kind of thing that's often used. This is a square version, but they're often spherical and they're used as the moon. And he just had it kind of in the main Jamal Fana Square for one night. And during that time, people kind of looked up and was curious about what it was, didn't really know, but then it started a conversation. And then people found out about the biennial, and so far we've had about 50,000 people go through the exhibition. Thank you.